This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Introduce the speaker, who is an old friend of the seminar, a long-standing friend of the seminar, who hasn't been for a while, but nevertheless, Professor David Turner, who of the University of Swansea, who is going to talk to the title "Becoming Disabled: Narrative, Emotion, and Identity in 18th Century England."
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. It's a good 3-hour train journey, which is why I haven't been quite as often as I would have liked. But it's great to be back and good to see a few familiar faces from the 1990s when I used to hang out in this building. There's another one, look. Right, where shall we start? Let's start on Hendon Common in 1742. On Tuesday the 28th of September, Bernard Gates became a victim of highway robbery. As he travelled on the London road between Hendon and Ealing, a man approached him on horseback and demanded his money at gunpoint. The robber had the cape of his coat about his face, but he looked a sickly sort of fellow. Gates reported the robbery to Lord Carpenter, whose men gave chase and quickly apprehended the assailant. Gates challenged the prisoner. He said, "Honest man, I think it is a surprising thing for a man in your condition to rob, for he seemed to be in a very bad way." Says he, "It's entirely necessity that has brought me to it." He confessed he came from London on purpose to rob, that he'd hired the horse and bought the pistol, that he really was in want. Tried at the Old Bailey a few weeks later, the sickly highway robber, Richard Arnold, was found guilty and sentenced to death. Making sense of his crime, the Ordinary of Newgate's account explained that Arnold had been an honest man until he became afflicted with a lingering disease that had rendered him incapable of business. As a result, he succumbed to a kind of despair and resolved in his own wicked mind to raise contributions on the highway. In the moralising narrative of the Ordinary's account, sickness served as a catalyst for a decisive and disruptive change in Arnold's life course, forcing him to deviate from the path of virtue to that of vice. It was a story we find repeated elsewhere in 18th century criminal biographies. For example, 36-year-old Richard Perrin, one of those convicted for the raid on the Poole Customs House in 1747, was described as a very honest man who'd been bred as a carpenter. He'd been looked upon as a good workman and had pretty business until the use of his right hand being in a great measure taken away by being subject to the palsy, he thought proper to leave that trade and take to smuggling. These criminal biographies participated in a wider 18th century discussion about the impact of disablement on a person's life course. In modern medical sociological terms, the lives of Arnold and Perrin, or at least the narratives constructed about them by the Ordinary of Newgate, appear to represent sickness or disability as a form of biographical disruption. This concept, first developed by Michael Berry in 1982, describes the ways in which disability or chronic illness, Arnold's lingering affliction, forces people to examine their plans for the future, bringing about a shift in priorities and relationships with others, and also challenges expectations of a normal, healthy life course. Biographical disruption raises questions about the extent to which disability or illness is thought of as having a negative impact on someone's life, and about what factors affect the quality of life of a sick or disabled person. These questions have loomed large in medical sociology and disability studies, but have yet to receive detailed historical attention. In 18th century crime narratives, biographical disruption was a morally purposeful way of explaining the chain of events that made people descend into criminality. Whereas Arnold defended his actions in terms of economic want and necessity, the Ordinary's blaming of his behaviour on a kind of despair caused by his physical afflictions brings his case into the realm of the history of emotions. Despair evoked a condition of mental disturbance that made the individual especially susceptible to sinful thoughts. The association of Arnold's physical health with despair is a reminder that the bodily and mental dimensions of impairment are inextricably linked. Both disability history and the history of emotions have expanded and gained increasing academic prominence since the turn of the 21st century. But apart from a significant body of work on psychiatric disorders, there has been relatively little dialogue between the fields. Disability history and history of emotions share some similar goals. Both are concerned at some level with questions of health, well-being and difference. The history of emotion teaches us that we can't draw a straightforward connection between the description of Richard Arnold's psychological state and his actual feelings. The insights of disability studies teach us that the fixing of particular negative emotions on people with disabilities have contributed to disabled people's marginalisation by supporting the medical model of disability that roots disability as a problem in individuals rather than something residing in the social, political and environmental world. For example, early 20th century orthopedic surgeons built the medical model of disability on the notion that the experience of disability in past centuries was inevitably pitiable or miserable, at least before modern medical science offered hopes for recovering the broken body. Thus, Sir Robert Jones, who pioneered rehabilitation for disabled children at the Baschurch Hospital in Shropshire, wrote in 1924 that for centuries, the cripple had crawled through his miserable, distorted life as an object of scorn, derision and pity. This model of disability as individual suffering rather than a social problem had been relentlessly promoted in the melodramatic accounts of impairment found in 19th century novels and autobiographies. These texts, Martha Stoddard Holmes has shown, recurrently and problematically represented disability as an emotional state, something that evoked pity and sympathy in onlookers and feelings of isolation and despair in the disabled. There is a need to examine further the social, cultural and literary contexts in which disability was associated with certain emotions such as despair or misery, and to look at the ideas that underpinned these connections. The aim of this paper is to begin to explore some of the emotional styles that were associated with physical or sensory impairment in 18th century England. It reviews various ways in which the feelings of people with disabilities were presented across a variety of medical, prescriptive, visual and media representations, and through a selection of personal testimonies. The paper also serves as more general reflection on ways in which historians of disability and emotion might work together and suggest some ways forward for future research. So I'll begin with a brief overview of how historians and literary scholars have discussed disability and emotion in the long 18th century before going on to looking at 18th century texts themselves. As far as the 18th century is concerned, historical debate on disability and emotion has focused largely on the ways in which impairment functioned as a touchstone for sympathy in the cultures of politeness and sensibility. The maimed body was a catalyst to strong expressions of emotion in others, a vehicle by which onlookers could demonstrate their finer feelings of compassion. Nevertheless, not all disabled bodies arouse the same kind of passions in others. The displaced disabled poor were frequently described with revulsion as dangerous and polluting forces that threatened London's status as a polite and commercial city. For example, in 1716, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu wrote of the loathsome cripples, as she called them, that thronged London's streets, which she saw as symptomatic of the dirt and beggary of the English metropolis. In contrast, the sight of wounded soldiers, especially amputees, or at least those not actively involved in begging, was sometimes described as rousing passions of patriotism and national pride. The Spectator's Sir Roger de Coverley explained in 1712 that when crossing the Thames, he always chose a waterman who had lost a leg or an arm, partly because he perceived those who'd been in the Queen's service to be more honest, but also so that he could prevail on the waterman to give him the history of his lost limb. When one amputee explained that he'd lost his leg at the Battle of La Hogue of 1692, Sir Roger, I quote, in the triumph of his heart, made several reflections on the greatness of the British nation, as to the inferiority of Frenchmen, and many other honest prejudices which naturally cleave to the heart of a true Englishman. Let's have a slide. As the 18th century wore on, the pleasures of pity intertwined with those of patriotism captured most vividly in the famously lachrymose encounter in Goldsmith's deserted village between a parish preacher and a wooden-legged soldier to whom he gives hospitality. This is depicted in this late 18th century print, which shows members of a family in a sitting room the soldier with his prominent wooden leg tells stories. As Goldsmith puts it, the broken soldier kindly bade to stay, sat by the fire and talked the night away, wept o'er his wounds or tales of sorrow done, shouldered his crutch and showed how fields were won. In turn the preacher watched and wept, he prayed and felt for all. In the cultural sensibility, how one reacted to the sufferings of others, of course, was an index of a person's humanity. For Adam Smith, the sight of the deformed, maimed or blind invoked especially strong feelings of pity to the point of creating a sympathetic somatic experience. Persons of delicate fibres and a weak constitution of body, he remarked, complain that in looking on the sores and ulcers that are exposed by beggars in the streets, they are apt to feel an itching or uneasy sensation in the correspondent part of their own bodies. The horror which they conceive at the misery of those wretches affects that particular part in themselves more than any other, because that horror arises from conceiving what they themselves would suffer if they really were the wretches whom they are looking upon. The very force of this conception is sufficient to produce that itching or uneasy sensation complained of. However, in recent historical accounts, the rise of what Norman Fearing referred to as irresistible compassion in relation to disability has received much important critical reappraisal. Simon Parkes, for example, has shown how sentimental portrayals of wooden-legged ex-servicemen served a significant purpose in containing the horrors of warfare and were a means of offsetting more troubling issues such as the disorderly presence of disabled ex-servicemen begging on the streets of later 18th century London and the military fiscal state's shortcomings in providing adequately for its maimed combatants, a theme explored in greater depth in Caroline Nielsen's recent PhD on the Chelsea outpensioners. Simon Dickey, in contrast, has challenged the extent to which 18th century literary culture actually subscribed to sympathetic values where physical difference was concerned. In his rich account of the unsentimental 18th century, Dickey describes a world in which deaf, blind and deformed characters were routinely mocked in jokes, theatrical entertainments and poetry, in which feelings of pity were constantly blunted by unshakable concerns about the fraudulent presentation of impairments by street beggars and others. Although Dickey's book, Cruelty and Laughter, is not theorised as a history of emotions, he is careful to acknowledge the potential distance between the derisive, unsentimental way in which disability was represented and how people actually felt or behaved when encountering a disability in real life. His book is important in challenging the dominant cultural script of sentimentality, although I'd argue that it ignores some of the subtleties of representation of disability in 18th century humour, which, as I argued in my book, Disability in 18th Century England, might challenge mawkish sentimentality through through lampooning the condescending pity of the non-disabled rather than simply mocking the afflicted. So far, though, few historians of the 18th century have examined the feelings, passions and utterances attributed to people described as impaired or chronically ill, to examine the perceived emotional ramifications of impairment. In other words, as far as the 18th century is concerned, studies have focused on the emotional reaction to disability rather than the emotions associated with disability itself. And this is what I want to turn to in the remainder of the paper. The discussion that follows is intended as nothing more than an overview to highlight some ideas that might be taken further in research. The task is made difficult not least because emotion and disability are concepts that change over time. The feelings described in our sources may not map easily onto modern scientific understandings of the emotions, whereas 18th century people with sensory or physical impairments would not necessarily have recognised themselves as sharing a common identity as disabled. These are things we need to bear in mind and which we might come back to in discussion later on. So, stories of impairment or illness making a profound change in people's lives were common in 18th century England. One of the most emotionally resonant phrases used to describe disablement, found often in 18th century newspapers, was the notion that someone had been rendered a cripple for life by an accident, act of violence, or by negligence. The term was used in various contexts to present disability in sensationalist terms, to evoke sympathy for victims while simultaneously provoking moral outrage. For example, the Weekly Journal reported in February 1728 the case of a Dusseldorf schoolboy who'd been whipped so severely by his Jesuit master that he will either die of it or be a cripple as long as he lives. The profound life-altering effects of serious injury were also emphasised in the handful of cases of victims suing others for deprivation of earnings after their actions had disabled them in an age before state-regulated employer liability for accidents in the workplace. In the Court of King's Bench in May 1747, for example, Mary Barrett successfully sued her master, a sheriff's officer, for £200 after he had violently bruised, maimed and made a cripple of her in such a manner as totally to render her incapable of getting her livelihood. Whatever the extent of her injuries, describing them in the worst possible terms as bringing about total disability was legally purposeful for the plaintiff in order to oppose any counter-allegations from her employer that she had unlawfully broken her terms of service by running away. The strategy was also used by plaintiffs in liability cases. Mr. Pallister, for example, won substantial damages against the proprietors of the Leeds and Sheffield mail coach in 1793 after it was proved that their negligence had led to an accident in which his wife had broken her leg and will forever be a cripple. Such cases hinged on proving that the defendant's actions or negligence had profoundly affected the victim's expectation of a productive, economically useful life. In these examples, it's clear that being made a cripple was a permanent, life-changing experience which damaged a person's well-being by affecting their economic capabilities. A 1769 newspaper report of an accident involving a glazier's servant in which he'd fallen 2 stories and broken his arm, thigh and fractured his skull, wrote that although there were great hopes of his recovery, he must remain a cripple all his lifetime. In this respect, being a cripple meant that he had to come to terms with his new status of victimhood. Contrasted with the word recovery, the cripple occupied a permanent state of liminality between health and illness. Further insights into the perceived disruptive effects of disablement were provided in the numerous personal testimonies found in adverts for medicines. Although advertisements are formulaic and the veracity of testimonies supposedly provided by customers is open to question, recurring themes reveal prominent fears about the disruptive or disturbing effects of chronic illness or impairment on patients' lives. The published testimonies of patients, drawn predominantly from the urban middling sort, frequently emphasise symptoms such as pain, fatigue and confinement that describe the misery of affliction in terms of lack of control. References to sufferers being reliant on sticks or crutches, being confined to certain spaces or to chairs and beds, utterly incapable of business, reinforce the connection between impairment and restriction or lack of liberty as something that imprisoned the individual and inhibited his or her engagement with the public world of commerce. Although concepts of self-control were gendered in the early modern period, with command over the self and others being central components in prescriptions for manhood, medical advertising described the afflictions of male and female patients in strikingly similar terms, showing the importance of bodily control for the health and well-being of both sexes. For instance, in 1714, Elizabeth Hughes, or Hughes, the wife of a corn meter from Wapping, described the symptoms of rheumatism and sciatica as leaving her reliant on crutches and unable to rest due to pain, to the extent that she said she could not endure the warmth of my bed, so that my life was a burden to me. After applying the cures sold by the apothecary John Moore, she apparently freed from my pain, so that I walk about my business as formerly. In a testimony that accompanied an advertisement for Whitehead's Essence of Mustard that appeared in the papers in 1797, a cure for the most inveterate cases of rheumatisms, lumbago, gout, palsy and the complaints of the stomach, etc., as it was advertised, W. Jenkins of Broadmead in Bristol complained of the most excruciating flying pains brought on by his rheumatic gout, which had left him so hopeless that he had ordered his workshops to be pulled down, as he felt he would never again be capable of business. A dramatic gesture that seemed to capture the despondency associated with what was believed to be a permanent state of debility. Mr. Drayton, a gentleman from Bath, was hardly able to walk across his room, even with crutches, after catching a violent chill 8 years previously, and his whole big frame was so unnerved as to render life burthensome. Finally, an account of Reverend Winder, paralysed by a stroke of palsy, published in the Gentleman's Magazine in 1770, described how he spent a miserable year in pain and despondency and suffered from a constant, very oppressive, heavy perception of pain fixed deep in his breast, which was always accompanied by that dejection of spirit when no further hope of recovery remains. This connection between the health of the body and the mind's emotional state was made repeatedly in narratives of affliction and cure in 18th century medical advertising. When Winder's symptoms were relieved after being struck by lightning, he was said to experience once more the joy of health. Got a dramatic way of getting better. Medical advertising presented disability or chronic illness first and foremost as something that profoundly affected the individual, disrupting the expectation of self-reliance and control that was essential to well-being. However, as Berry noted, an important aspect of biographical disruption is the way in which illness or disability brings individuals, their families, and wider social networks face to face with the character of their relationships. Indeed, it's evident from reading a broader range of personal testimonies that disability might bring about disruption in the biographical expectations of family members and not just the disabled person, him or herself. And a very good example of this can be found in the memoirs of the Somerset exciseman John Cannon, which are very useful to for disability historians as well as those of 18th century sexualities. Cannon recorded an accident that had happened in 1688 when his 3-year-old younger brother Thomas had been playing, running and jumping about, when suddenly he lost his footing and, in Cannon's memorable words, fell and broke himself. In spite of the efforts of doctors, the rupture was incurable and continued at times and seasons with great pain to the day of his death many years later. Though the implications of his brother's accident could not have been fully appreciated at the time by the 4-year-old John Cannon, looking back on the event many years later, the memoirist described it as having a profound effect on his own aspirations in life. This infirmity of his, he wrote, gave a handle for his parents to humour and favour him more than his sister or myself. Cannon recorded his anger at being made to leave school and abandon his natural bookish leanings at the age of 13 to go and work on the family farm, whilst his brother was allowed to stay on and receive the education that Cannon saw as being wasted on him, since he was more naturally inclined to plough and husbandry. John regarded Thomas's infirmity as having a profound effect on the emotional dynamics of his family, leading to what he called a perpetual indulgence of his brother's wishes, whilst I, poor I, he wrote, fared daily by far more inferior. Despite the cultural power of narratives that emphasised the damaging effects of illness or impairment, attitudes towards disablement in 18th century England were more complex and subject to a range of variables. Timing, context, norms, and the symbolic significance of a particular illness or disabling condition were all crucial in determining its impact on a person's life course and well-being. Indeed, it was a long-held view, from Puritan religious conduct literature to 18th century essay periodicals, that misfortune was part of God's design, and that illness, physical or sensory impairment, was the fate of every man. Using the example of Christ's cure of the cripple at the pool of Bethesda as an example, the theologian William Bragg urged people to bear with disability stoically, for it will wind up at last in a happy conclusion. Each person, noted the Spectator in 1711, has a natural weight of affliction, whereas a correspondent to the London Daily Advertiser in 1752 remarked that disability was the lot of human nature and common to multitudes. So we find these sentiments expressed throughout the period. In particular, physical and sensory impairment was central to the ageing process. The conduct book A Word to the Aged of 1667, for instance, described infirmity as the crown of old age and counselled older readers that although they may become timorous and fearful due to their physical weakness and impending mortality, there was, I quote, a peculiar honour that is twisted with your infirmity, make it symbolic of a life well lived. This indelible association between bodily weakness and old age made it common for younger writers to view their own infirmities as a sign of premature ageing. Horace Walpole, for instance, described the gout that afflicted him from the age of 38 as hastening the ageing process, writing that in spite of his crippling illness, he was determined to feel young still. 10 years later, when feeling low-spirited, the message that infirmity was an honour of old age was lost. The loss of youth is melancholy enough, but to enter old age through the gate of infirmity is most disheartening. So this theme of premature ageing, I think, is one of the it's a kind of recurrent way of thinking about disability. My colleague Leighton James, written on the memoirs of Prussian army officers in the Napoleonic War, and found that theme coming up over again, and we find it as well as into the 19th and 20th century in various contexts. Deformity or chronic illness is also seen as a natural consequence of particular types of work. Whereas purveyors of proprietary medicines aimed their products at the middling sort by emphasising how chronic illness disrupted expectations of wealth and commercial success by making someone incapable of business, for many in 18th century England, ill health or disability was an occupational hazard, not the enemy of hard work, but a consequence of it. Bernardino Ramazzini's treatise on occupational health was translated into English in 1705, and by the second half of this century his view that violent and disorderly motions and improper postures of the body in labour, together with the noxious materials that many worked with, caused disability, this view is widely held in the medical profession. To Ramazzini, the idea that certain trades were distinguished by particular infirmities seemed to reinforce a sense of occupational identity, as he observed in the funeral processions of Paduan tailors or shoemakers, in which they seemed to flaunt their crooked, hunchbacked, lame figures, as if they were set to act such a part on purpose. Similarly, the old seafaring term, a gold chain or a wooden leg, which had become a motto of British servicemen by the second half of the century, seemed to claim amputation as the natural reward of military or naval service. Amputation was a significant part of the cultural identity of the broken soldier or sailor in the 18th century, symbolising the loss of limb as a heroic sacrifice. This was exploited by ex-soldiers and sailors who supplemented their pension or income by begging, whose missing limbs provided visible proof of their heroism. But this may have made it difficult for the majority of disabled soldiers who weren't amputees to claim honorific status. In these representations, amputation didn't so much disrupt a soldier or sailor's life course as provide a tool for reaffirming their identity as the heroic servants of the crown. The relationship between disability and quality of life was further seen as being dependent on the attitude of the patient and the circumstances of disablement. Every evil becomes more supportable by our being accustomed to it, advised the Spectator in 1714, using the allegorical tale of the Mount of Miseries, where all of afflicted humankind, from the poor galley slave to the humpbacked gentleman, went to swap their misfortunes in the misguided opinion that other people had it easier. Those who learnt to accept their changed physical circumstances offered admirable examples to all. Again, in the theory of moral sentiments, Smith used the example of a man learning to come to terms with dismemberment and his reliance on a prosthetic limb as proof, he said, of the never-failing certainty with which all men sooner or later accommodate themselves to whatever becomes their permanent situation. A man with a wooden leg suffers, he said, no doubt, and foresees that he must continue to suffer during the remainder of his life a very considerable inconveniency. He soon comes to view it, however, exactly as every impartial spectator views it, as an inconveniency under which he can enjoy all the ordinary pleasures, both of solitude and society. He soon identifies himself with the ideal man within the breast. He soon becomes himself the impartial spectator of his own situation. He no longer weeps, he no longer laments, he no longer grieves over it, as a weak man may do in the beginning. The view of the impartial spectator becomes so perfectly habitual to him that, without any effort, without any exertion, he never thinks of surveying his misfortune in any other view. The emotional consequences of sudden disablement were deemed more damaging than those of gradual impairment. So, according to an essay published in The Adventurer in 1754, sudden illness or incapacity caused the spirits to sink, whereas those people who'd had a longer time to adjust to new circumstances could approach their disability with an air of waggish jocularity. In his autobiographical Deformity, an Essay, published in 1754, William Hay prescribed good-humoured stoical acceptance of one's lot as a means by which the deformed might come to terms with their stigmatised appearance. Cheerfulness was a key quality of mind. Francis Bacon had recommended cheerfulness as a remedy against extremes of passion, and in the Georgian era it was regularly recommended in guides to health and good manners. For example, an essay on the most rational means of preserving health, published in 1799, regarded it an established opinion that the state of mind has a considerable effect on the state of the body, and that an habitual cheerfulness of temper is highly conducive to health. Feelings such as fear or despair might hasten the demise of the sick or impaired, since, I quote, they weaken the nerves, retard the circular motion of the fluids, hinder perspiration, and impair digestion. Such advice was relevant to all, but the culture of cheerfulness was particularly important in masculine institutions such as the army and navy. Now we have a cheerful old sailor having a drink in the pub with his companion, a man with no arms, who's having his drinks poured into his mouth by a woman who works there. In contrast to the tearful veteran in Goldsmith's deserted village, satirical prints and jest books routinely portrayed servicemen reacting to horrific dismemberment with a well-chosen quip, James Bond-like, calling for the carpenter to make a wooden leg instead of the surgeon and so on. When describing their own experience on the battlefield, ex-servicemen also adopted this position as a form of spirited defiance and refusal of victimhood. In Major General Charles Austin's memoir of losing his leg whilst fighting in the disastrous Valcherand campaign in the Napoleonic Wars, the author stressed his determination to meet the exigency of amputation with becoming fortitude. Austin wrote of his admiration for those, including enemy soldiers, who retained their bearing, as he put it, under traumatic circumstances, and recalled how he had attempted to raise the spirits of those about to be operated upon by instilling some little cheerfulness into my fellow sufferers. For a military officer, cheerfulness was a quality that was essential to preserving manly self-command and command over others in the most desperate of circumstances. But mental resilience in the face of bodily fallibility was a quality widely praised in women as well as men. Thus, an obituary for Mary Perdita Robinson, published in 1800, noted that during the final 12 years of her life, she was, I quote, the martyr of a severe and incurable rheumatism, in consequence of which she became a cripple. But this could not suppress the fertility of her genius or the energies of her character. Nevertheless, some forms of impairment were deemed worse than others, in assessments that depended as much on the cultural significance of the body's functions and senses as they did on their perceived effects on the individual. Those physical deformities that affected the shape of the spine or caused restriction of movement, whether through hereditary defect or acquired through disease, were deemed to have particularly harmful effect on the patient's emotional state. In his essay on crookedness or distortions of the spine, the cover of which I've put on the left-hand side of this slide, Philip Jones noted that twisted bodies hurt the eye and often raise very painful reflections in the minds of those who are the innocent, though unhappy objects. As the inventor of a machine for straightening the spines of young people, Jones, of course, had a commercial interest in the perceived mental torments of spinal patients. But his views reflected medical orthodoxy, as he was very keen to point out. The spine, he noted, was the body's second brain, whose health and positioning affected physical and mental well-being. Spinal deformity impeded the flow of the vital spirits, leading to the accumulation of crude and vitiated humours, which could affect the state of a patient's mind if it wasn't treated. Young women in particular were deemed especially vulnerable to these complaints on account of the delicacy of their frames being more subject to debility than the other sex and devoting themselves more to a sedentary life. From the middle of the 18th century, there was a growing interest in social orthopedics following the publication of Nicholas Andre's Orthopedia in 1743, which I've a page from that on the other side of this slide, showing the correction of a crooked limb through the image of a sapling being tethered to a stake, an image perhaps most famous for its use on Foucault, the cover of Foucault's Discipline and Punishment. So following the publication of Orthopedia, with methods and devices for training young bodies into upright forms, which are both aesthetically pleasing and morally wholesome. Spinal deformity, together with palsy, stroke and paralysis, might further impede movement and exercise, damaging health by impeding the circulation of blood and enervating the nervous system. Mobility was an important sign of wellness, and those who had lost the ability to walk altogether were deemed to be in a particularly woeful state, often subject to despair and hopelessness. A newspaper account of a stroke suffered by the painter Jonathan Richardson noted that although the paralytic stroke had affected his arm, it was a blessing that it had never disabled him from his customary walks and exercise. So Richard Steele was less fortunate. His obituary, published in 1729, noted that he'd become paralytic in his later years, and being perfectly disabled for all sorts of business, study and conversation, having in great measure lost his speech as well as the use of his limbs, was forced to retire to Carmarthen, where he lingered several years in that unhappy condition. Situation made no doubt worse by being stuck in Carmarthen. I've been there, you know. Anyway, moving on. The emotional impact of blindness was compared to deafness as part of the broader broader Enlightenment debate about the hierarchy of the senses. The status of sight as the sovereign of the senses and the mother of all arts and sciences, the agent of politeness, civilization, poetry and scientific discovery, meant that its loss was, in the words of the Spectator, very grievous. The vulnerability of the blind and their reliance on others to guide them also emphasise the importance of independence in notions of well-being. Other commentators regarded deafness as a more miserable state, since those unable to hear were not able to receive divine wisdom, partake in sociability, or express themselves. Jonathan Swift described his loss of hearing as the greatest loss of any, and more comfortless than even being blind. To be blind, suggested Weedon Butler in a letter to the Gentleman's Magazine in 1807, was not half so pitiable as being deaf, because the pleasures of conversation and the charms of music can much alleviate their want of sight. Yet without one ray of intellectual comfort from social intercourse or religious principle, deafness was a condition mournful in the extreme. The deaf were, according to a medical advertisement of 1773, attended with such oppressive discomfort and continued uneasiness of mind as none can be truly sensible who have not in some degree witnessed it in themselves. The same year, a newspaper described the case of a deaf and dumb lad who had attempted to hang himself through, I quote, despair of making any impression on his mistress, owing to his inability to express himself verbally. Happily, however, he was quickly discovered and cut down, and this proof of his affection had so great an effect upon his sweetheart that, we hear, she has consented to marry him. By the end of the 18th century, arguments about the perceived unhappiness of the deaf or the blind were used to justify philanthropic intervention to provide education to turn them into useful and productive citizens. An account of the Liverpool Asylum for the Blind, shown here in this rather austere engraving, published in the London Chronicle of 1792, saw the training of blind children as necessary to relieve them from the wearisome state of inactivity. Through work such as the manufacturing of articles which engaged the hands without requiring sight, the children were, it said, thus rendered happy in themselves, useful in their community, useful to the community, and their parents relieved of the burden of their support. Influenced by Rousseau, late 18th century and early 19th century pioneers of special education and their benefactors saw themselves as transforming unhappy individuals into happy citizens. This was, as Jan Soderfeldt and Peter Verstraete have recently argued in a fantastic article on the history of happiness, these evidence the ways in which emotion was used as a means of controlling people with disabilities by elevating happiness from a private feeling into a public good, in the process measuring the well-being of the deaf and blind against a productive, predictable, socially useful norm. Discussion of the ways in which happiness is harnessed to justify the provision of special schooling is a powerful reminder that accounts of the perceived emotional state of people with disabilities often serves a political purpose, fixing certain emotions on the impaired as a justification for increasing intervention in their lives. This aspect of the modern medical model of disability was becoming more evident as the 18th century drew to a close. In this paper, I've examined some of the ways in which various emotional states were attributed to people with different types of impairments. The idea that chronic illness or disability caused a major disruption to a person's life course was a powerful theme in this period, but it was used strategically and rhetorically, and is not necessarily a true reflection of people's experiences. In practice, experiences of disablement were influenced by a variety of factors, including the availability of familial and community support, occupational structures, and a person's access to welfare and medical services. Indeed, as Martha Stoddard Holmes has argued, the construction of disability as a feeling state serves to minimise the material factors that affect all people with disabilities. Public discourses of disability in 18th century England focused on personal qualities and characteristics in evaluating the effects of disablement on well-being. The presence of pain, fatigue, loss of control, and the degree of disruption to routine were all thought to bear on the degree of misery that a person experienced. The idea of infirmity as an expected part of the life course was also important, and people were urged to bear stoically with their afflictions. In spite of the perceived cultural dominance of the idea of disability as a pitiable state, the cheerfulness, merriment or jocularity of people with disabilities was also discussed, admired and prescribed as a healthy response to physical setbacks. Indeed, some 18th century writers went as far as to argue that impairment might be a source of happiness in itself. For example, in 1753, the World periodical related a Spanish story concerning a blind, deaf and dumb man who suddenly regained his senses at the age of 52. Despite his initial feelings of joy, he soon began to lose the relish of his enjoyment and to repine at the possession of those faculties, which served only to discover to him the follies and disorders of his neighbours, and to teach him that the intent of speech was too often to deceive. Well liked by his neighbours before his cure, thanks, of course, to his cheerful submission to so deplorable a misfortune, he quickly lost the affections of his neighbours when he began to point out their newly discovered faults. Sensory deprivation was portrayed as giving a person a privileged access to an antediluvian state of innocence. The inability of the deaf and dumb to converse sociably was offset, according to other writers, by their minds being less polluted with vain discourse. Blindness was portrayed as giving wisdom and insight, since the visually impaired were deemed less susceptible to worldly distractions. At a less spiritual level, the attentiveness of others and physical intimacy that impairment like license could be construed by some as an unexpected pleasure of incapacity. James Boswell, who else, found that his sinking spirits caused by the searing pain and physical indisposition of an ingrown toenail, found that his spirits were raised, temporarily at least, by an encounter at an inn in Newcastle upon Tyne as he journeyed from London to Edinburgh in May 1779. There, an agreeable young widow nursed me and supported my lame foot on her knee. Am I not fortunate, he reflected, in having something about me that interests most people at first sight in my favour? So this has been a necessarily brief and incomplete overview of the ways in which disablement and its emotions were represented in Georgian England. If nothing else, it's highlighted the need for further work into the emotional experiences of disability in the past. There are, I think, several directions in which such work could take. So I'll end with just sort of throwing open some suggestions. Firstly, I think we need to know more about how people's expectations and emotional reaction to disability differed according to stage in the life cycle, in particular the experiences of disabled children, and how it differed according to occupation, class and gender. Writers predominantly concern themselves with evaluating the position and emotional state of men with disabilities. Men may have felt the emotional impact of inability to work and the threat of losing occupational identity more keenly, although it's clear that female patients were addressed in very similar terms by those peddling cures for chronic complaints. We need to examine further the impact of disability on women's roles and women's lives. Work by Chris Mounsey, for example, I think provides lots of very interesting insights using the autobiographical poetry of Priscilla Poynton. This offers one way forward. Another approach is being developed by my student Gemma Almond at Swansea University, who's starting to uncover the impact of disability on childbearing and motherhood in late 18th and early 19th century England, and she's starting to shed light on the impact of impairment on women's social and familial roles in an age that, as Joanne Bailey has shown, sentimentalised parenthood. Fresh insights will also be gained by taking a material culture approach to disability and emotion. We've noted how objects such as wooden legs stirred up strong feelings of patriotism or pity in others, but the ways in which individuals negotiated the painful experience of limb loss and invested meaning in prosthetic devices, which were, at the top end of the market at least, becoming increasingly personalised and realistic as the century drew to a close. But taking a disability perspective might alter our understanding of the uses and effective meanings of everyday objects, as well as specialist assistive technology. As we've seen today, testimonies of affliction often cast household items such as chairs and beds as powerful symbols of a person's incapacity and restriction from the world. What might be an item of comfort for some might be a source of confinement for others. Taking a disability perspective also reminds us that bodily practices such as touch and intimacy might acquire different meanings when applied to the impaired body. Whatever pleasures Boswell took from invalidism, the experience of incapacity might transform intimacy into a form of control and power, advertising a patient's vulnerability and dependency on others for mundane tasks. This is a theme that we find repeatedly in 18th century correspondence, where men in particular talk about their sort of feelings of their sort of infantile dependency on others when they're sort of laid up with gout, and the sort of disgrace really of being having to be sort of carried around like babies, as Walpole put it, by their servants. So clearly there's much more to be done. Thanks so much.